Hello, my name is Greg Joachim, and on behalf of my co-authors, who you see named on the screen here, I'll be walking you through our study, An Intervention to Introduce a Design Thinking Activity into the Practice of a Professional Sport Organization, in this case being the Sydney Sixers of the Women's and Men's Big Bash League. But before we get to that, I will also introduce myself, even though it's probably not wise to, considering I only have 10 minutes. But I have just finished my PhD, and so I am on the hunt for a full-time faculty position. I have passed my thesis examination, and so I'm currently awaiting conferral, which I expect to happen in the new year. So technically I'll finish in 2021, even though all is done and dusted in regard to the thesis. And that thesis was concerned with the use of design thinking in the field of sport management. It is the first empirical study of design thinking in the practice of sport organizations. And that is part of what I'll be walking you through today. If you haven't heard of design thinking before, I like to define it broadly as a user-centered method for generating innovation in non-design contexts. And that innovation might be solving some kind of problem which arises or which is facing the sector in which the organization operates, or even some opportunity that they would like to capitalize upon and make the most of. In management, design thinking is thought of as making the thinking and the doing, the ostensive and performative dimensions of expert design practice available to non-designers, usually in non-design contexts. So it is this idea that by learning to behave like expert designers, managers can uncover unmet needs of their users, perhaps through surprising insights, and really generate that value for those end users. And if you have heard of the concept before, you've likely heard of one of the models that you see on the screen here, perhaps the three-step repeating cycle from the design consultancy IDEO, introduced by Tim Brown in 2008. 3 cycles of inspiration, ideation, and implementation. Or perhaps you've seen the knowledge funnel from Roger Martin, which converts mysteries into algorithms and then aims to exploit those algorithms. Or perhaps most likely you have heard of the Stanford D-School model for design thinking, a 5-step process of empathizing with users, defining the problem, ideating solutions, prototyping solutions, and then testing those prototypes with real users in natural settings before starting again and constantly iterating and improving upon those designs. And whenever we look at design thinking being adopted into managerial practice, the mindsets, the principles, the techniques, the practices which are associated with those practices, those design thinking practices, all come back to the 5 themes that you see on the screen here. And so for this reason, I've adapted these 5 themes: user focus, problem framing, visualization, experimentation, and diversity as my theoretical framework for not only the whole thesis, but also for the current study. And so prior to this study that I'm speaking to you about today, I used that theoretical framework to look for indicators of design thinking alignment in the sport for development field, because I thought that nonprofit and public and volunteer organizations, which are mostly what populate the sport for development field, might be able to make use of the very low resource process of design thinking to generate better experiences for their users, which of course is what most of those organizations are all about. And I did find indicators of alignment right across the breadth of sport for development research. And in the case of 14 studies out of 80 in particular, I found alignment with all 5 themes, which suggested that design thinking might hold value for sport organizations, that it would be a good fit, in other words, for their organization. And so that led me to the Sydney Sixers, who, even though they are a professional sport organization, do focus on some community efforts, but they do have a number of challenges, internal and external challenges. And even where they have opportunities, such as having half the state of New South Wales being their geographic catchment, that of course is a huge opportunity in terms of population, but has the embedded challenge of, as you likely know, New South Wales is not a small geographic place. And so to meaningfully engage with users in faraway communities such as Merimbula on the south coast, almost on the Victoria border, a solid 6-hour drive away from the SCG, that's quite a challenge. And so they were quite receptive to the idea of using design thinking in their practice, and that's what led us to working together. And the first part of my work with them was taking that theoretical framework and trying to determine, do they have the performative capabilities of design thinking already? that would allow me to come and introduce the ostensive, being the idea of design thinking, the human-centered focus of design thinking, into their practice in a meaningful way. And they did have alignment with all 5 themes of design thinking, which led me to the current study that I'm speaking to you about, which was a qualitative intervention that sought to identify and introduce a design thinking activity into the Sixers practice, which aligned with the way that they like to work. So I collected data through semi-structured interviews, observation, and shadowing. And then I won't be able to walk you through all of this. It's a little too detailed, but the benefit of this being online, of course, is that you can pause it and have a look at it yourself. But in 3 broad phases of exploration, intervention, and evaluation, I sought to identify a design thinking activity which suited the way that they like to work, which I identified through some emergent criteria that I'll put on the screen in a moment, introduce that activity to them in an intervention workshop, and then evaluate how did that go in terms of the suitability for their practice. Did it actually fit into their practice the way I wanted it to? And how did it fit into those 5 themes of design thinking? And so in exploring how the Sixers like to work, a lot of what they do came back to the why of their business. The general manager told me we spent a lot of time in our planning days pulling everything, the key functional areas apart, and then based on the why, building the blocks back in. And sometimes they go back in exactly how you pulled them out, but you might find something that gives you an extra 5%, and that's what we're looking for. And so that focus on those marginal gains that she used the metaphor of a race car pit crew, of course, which is always disassembling and reassembling the motor of the car, the engine of the car, not because of reinventing the way engines work, but just trying to find those marginal efficiencies which make the car run that much better. And so through my exploration, I identified 7 criteria of suitability for the Sixers practice. I don't have time to get into this table in great detail, but again, you can pause here and have a look if you like to see what kind of activity I was looking for to introduce into the Sixers practice. And ultimately, I came up with the Lightning Decision Jam, which is a structured brainstorming activity that prompts teams in non-design contexts or design contexts to consider roadblocks that are impeding their progress toward their goals. And through, as I said, a very structured process, a timed process of individual work and reflection, and then group work and reflection, and a lot of consensus generating. And as you can see in the photos on the slides there, the use of sticky dots on Post-it notes to vote for the ideas that will move forward. Eventually, you arrive at what we call a value matrix, where the vertical axis is that of impact, high impact versus low impact ideas, and the horizontal axis is that of effort. What kind of effort would it take to implement this idea? Are we talking about high effort or low effort? And so the team put this together based on their own consensus. The general manager kind of plotted things out on that matrix, and you can see that 3 ideas, A, B, and C, prioritizing work based on impact, regular brainstorming, and diary management, were seen as potentially high impact ideas that required low effort. And so in that money quadrant, the top left quadrant, those will be the ideas that the team pursues first. And these were ideas in response to how they work with each other, as well as how they work with some of their partners within Cricket New South Wales and also external to Cricket New South Wales. And so it went very well. They enjoyed the activity, which was nice to see. One staff member on their way out of the intervention where I introduced the activity to them mentioned to me that she noticed the more that the activity went on, more Post-it notes were going up on the wall, the creative juices were flowing. And the general manager, in addressing the team after the activity, said to them, "This is how I want us to think," which I took as being very encouraging. And they did continue to use this activity and incorporate it into their annual planning cycle. And so the implication from our intervention, there are a couple. The first one is that it foregrounds design thinking as being a useful derivative theory from the broader field of management. Design thinking is a theory of practice. Perhaps you're not used to thinking of it that way if you have heard of it, but it is a theory of practice. And our study here shows that it can be useful in the context of sport organizations. Our intervention framework also provides a framework for fitting design thinking into sport management practice. Perhaps that would be complicated, but I'm hoping to simplify that in future studies. And the LDJ, the Lightning Decision Jam, is highlighted as a useful brainstorming activity for sport practitioners with or without design thinking. This creates a couple interesting future directions for study, being longitudinal studies of sport organizations using design thinking in their practice, as well as exploring the relationship between designer identity and sport management identity, perhaps crossing threshold concepts in both, or even defining new threshold concepts. But that, of course, is for another day. Thank you very much for tuning into our presentation. I hope you found it interesting. Please do feel free to reach out if you would like to hear more than just 10 minutes about what we did here. By email, greg.yoakum@uts.edu.au, or I am on Twitter @GregYoakum.